I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening's event, Madison Hopkins. Ms. Hopkins is an investigative reporter at the Better Government Association, a 95-year-old nonpartisan and nonprofit watchdog organization. Since joining the BGA in 2016, her reporting has focused on energy, the environment, and local government. She co-wrote a 3-part series on the nuclear power industry in Illinois that exposed some significant issues in oversight by federal regulators. Ms. Hopkins earned her master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in August 2016 and was a recipient of the National Press Foundation's Thomas L. Stokes Award for Best Energy Writing in 2018. In 2018, she published a report with the BGA on the state of recycling in Chicago. This report highlighted trends and practices that have contributed to Chicago's worst in the nation recycling rate. Please join me in welcoming Madison Hopkins.
Okay, hello. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so happy to see there's so many people that actually want to learn about recycling, so this is great. Before we get started, I just want to say a thank you to C2ST for putting on this event, along with NWRD, Chicago Public Library, and the BGA, my employer. So really, thank you. And I just want to give you a little bit of background on me and how I fit into all of this before we bring our panelists out. As you just heard, over at the BGA, we've spent much of the past year reporting on kind of the latest twists and turns in the long and complex history of recycling in Chicago. We started off by looking at the City of Chicago's residential blue cart program for smaller buildings. And we found that the government oversight of the partially privatized program was seriously lacking. We specifically found that within the contracts between the city and the private companies that it hired to pick up the contents of the blue carts in much of the city, there was a loophole that created a financial incentive for one of those companies to divert much of its recyclable materials to landfills that it owns. So as a result, thousands of tons of recycling in Chicago was being diverted to a landfill, and this private company was getting paid twice for the same materials, once to treat it as recycling and once to treat it as garbage. So after that, we decided we wanted to take a look at recycling in the bigger buildings in Chicago, because even though all the mid-rises and high-rises don't technically fall into that blue cart program, they are required by law to offer recycling services to their tenants. And we found that in those bigger buildings, recycling isn't going so great either. Even though they're required, we found that the city rarely enforces its rules. And out of the 77,000 buildings that fall into this law, the city has only ever inspected about 0.6%, which means that nobody really has any idea what the true state of recycling is. So with that, I'm hoping we can get started on a conversation tonight about the many issues and complexities facing recycling in Chicago and across the globe. And I'd like to bring up our panelists who have been a huge help to me throughout my reporting on the past year on this topic and lead up to this event. So for starters, we have Dr. Kuldeep Kumar, who is a senior scientist in the Monitoring and Research Department of Chicago's Metropolitan Water and Reclamation District. He was more than 20, yes, thank you. Kuldeep has more than 25 years of experience in the area of water quality, especially fate and transport of nutrients and other environmental stressors like pharmaceuticals and personal care products. For the last 5 years, Dr. Kumar's focus has been on evaluating and developing new technologies to recover resource wastewater with a focus on nutrient removal and recovery. He has published over 70 research articles and books and has served on many federal grant review panels. Welcome, thank you. Next up, we have Carter O'Brien. Carter is the Field Museum Sustainability Officer and works in the Keller Science and Action Center. As chair of the museum's green team, he works to institutionalize sustainability principles in areas such as recycling, food operations, alternative transportation, urban agriculture, and renewable energy. In 2008, he received Fair Trade Chicago's first ever Changemaker of the Year award. A Chicago native, he is also the vice president of the Chicago Recycling Coalition. Welcome, Carter. And last but not least, we have Michelle Thoma, who is the board president of the Chicago Recycling Coalition. Thoma is general counsel at Elevate Energy, an environmental services firm that seeks to create a world in which everyone has clean and affordable heat, power, and water in their homes and communities, no matter who they are or where they live. She holds a JD Law degree from Loyola University of Chicago School of Law. So, first off, thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. I'm very excited to have you all. From speaking to each of you and lead up to this, I think it's safe to say that recycling is something that you all care about deeply and are very passionate about, so I'm thrilled that we're going to get to share some of that expertise with the audience today. So, it's a little note to the audience. How it's going to work is some questions. We're hoping to get through with them, but we're going to have plenty of time for you all to ask your own questions at the end. And okay, with that, I guess we should get started. Start off, whenever we're talking about recycling, I think it's important to take a big step back and think about why is it that we recycle? What does recycling even mean? I'm regularly surprised by the number of people I meet that generally know recycling is a good thing and sustainable, but don't know exactly how that happens or why we do it. So, Kuldeep, I'm hoping you can start us off by explaining a bit about why is it that we recycle, and what would be the environmental consequences if there was no recycling?
Thank you, Madison. First of all, welcome to all of you audience, and what a wonderful place for this event. And welcome all, and I already see our commissioner sitting there in the audience. Thanks for coming. For me, I'm very big on sustainability, you know. How many of you know about the Earth Overshoot Day? Please raise your hands. Anybody knows about the Earth Overshoot Day?
Earth Overshoot Day?
Yes.
Yes.
So only a couple of people. So let me tell you about that. What does that mean? So we have limited resources on this Earth, whether it's ecological services or natural resources. So ideally, sustainability, if we have lived here for billions of years, and if we have to live here for future billions of years, we should be spending only the resources which are available by the Mother Earth during that year. So 1972 onwards, it changed. So we started exploiting more resources than this Earth can sustain. So 1973, by December 26th, that was the Earth Overshoot Day. And from 1972 to 2019, so that day is moving forward every year. And this year it was probably August 2nd. So that means it's by August 2nd, we already used all the resources from the Earth which the Mother Earth can sustainability provide. And there are a lot of limited resources, copper, zinc, phosphorus, other metals, and of course, gasoline and for energy. So for me, we have to not only conserve those resources because, number one, few of them are very limited. So recycling is a very, very important way to conserve those resources, to prolong so that our kids don't suffer from those resource crunch. There was a very good article that if you're born in 2010, how much is left for me? So you're an 8, 9-year-old kid, and you're wondering how much of those resources are left for me. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Phosphorus, which is an essential element for plants' growth and our growth and our survival, is going to last another 70 to 100 years. Zinc and copper, we may be out of zinc and copper of the known resources in 30, 40 years. So those are the drivers for me to promote recycling in every way I can.
Thank you. Michelle, can you explain a bit how residential recycling programs like what we do in Chicago can benefit those sustainable goals?
Sure. There are a lot of other reasons to recycle, and so those so recycling in Chicago, when it's done right, can support those goals. And some of those other aspects of recycling that are positive for all of us are that recycling can be an environmental justice issue. If we're looking at materials as resources instead of waste, then we're valuing them, we're taking care of them, and we are reusing them. But when we look at them as waste, then we're landfilling them. And landfills have to be placed somewhere. And so often, historically, landfills are placed in communities that are low-income communities and communities of color. And so that's been shown disproportionately that landfills and toxic waste dumps are cited in those areas. So having a recycling program, a robust recycling program can help address environmental justice issues, and it also creates jobs. There are 35 jobs in recycling as opposed to 1 in landfilling. It contributes to the economy, and typically recycling jobs are safer too. So those are just a couple of ways that having a robust recycling program can improve our environment and our economy, as well as address issues of justice and potentially racism as well.
Great, thank you. So talking about robust recycling programs, here in Chicago, we have 2 different programs, as I mentioned earlier. For the smaller residential buildings, the city provides their blue cart service, and in the larger buildings, they're required to hire their own private haulers. But at the baseline, all Chicago residents are supposed to have access to something called source-separated single-stream recycling. So Carter, I was hoping you could explain just what that is. What is source-separated single-stream recycling? And give a little insight into how Chicago's recycling options have evolved over the years to get to where we are right now.
Sure, thank you. I'll start back when I first started recycling in Chicago, actually. So there's a fellow named Ken Dunn that some of you might be familiar with. And Ken Dunn set up the first recycling centers I'm familiar with in Hyde Park, I believe, and then there was another one in Lincoln Park, which was closer to where I lived. And so you would show up bringing your recyclables. This was in the late 80s. And you would dutifully sort the glass by color, and then you would throw in your cans. And I think another thing for paper, if I remember correctly. So, that was the sort of, it was, it took a little bit of effort, as a citizen to do this, and you had to be dedicated enough to bring your recycling to the single facility. But that was what was in place, and then I went to school in Urbana-Champaign, and I came back, and I didn't live anywhere near any recycling, so I kind of got out of the habit for sure. And then the city of Chicago brought the Blue Bag program into existence. I'm willing to bet many people in the room have heard of the Blue Bag, and I'm also willing to bet if I asked you how many people think that it worked well, I will not, yes, the thumbs are going in the downward direction, I believe. And I think the damage of the Blue Bag program, above and beyond the fact that, people were going through all the motions and there wasn't a whole lot of evidence that the material was being successfully captured and recycled into something new, was it really turned a good generation off of recycling, from what I can tell. I mean, it was in existence from 1995 all the way until 2012, I believe, 2013?
2011.
2011, they phased it out, with the pilots for the Blue Card. But all the people that were used to blue bag systems, by the time the Blue Carts rolled around, they really had gotten kind of a little bit turned off on the program altogether. So, you have people that were really excited when the Blue Cart showed up, and it was like, finally, we're kind of modernizing, and we're joining, quote, the rest of the world with single-stream recycling. But single-stream recycling, as the sort of world is evolving and as things, especially like packaging, is getting more and more complicated, what we're finding is that single-stream recycling is also a bit of a problem, because you're mashing all of the ingredients together, and then you're sort of trying to take them all apart in a MRF, material recovery facility. And then, many times they're getting commingled, they're contaminating each other. So, soda pop from the can is getting into the paper, which is making it, not suitable for recycling. Broken glass gets into the fibers in the cardboard, et cetera. And so, what we have at the moment is a single stream program that was already somewhat limping along in Chicago until, we hit sort of the crisis mode with the Chinese National Sword campaign. And for folks that I think will come back to it later, but what basically happened was China said we're no longer going to take anything but the absolute purest recycling streams that you could get us, and this really disrupted the entire commodity market that recycling depends on, because putting it in the blue cart is kind of one thing, but really somebody needs to, successfully separate it, bale it, and sell it to somebody that's going to reuse it. And this does happen in many industries, especially in steel, for example. Chicago turns around an incredible amount of steel and does so very successfully. But this doesn't necessarily translate back to the user of the blue carts. And so source-separated recycling, the idea is that you've got the folks with the blue carts that are in the 1 to 4 unit buildings, and then the folks that are served by the 5+ unit buildings, the high rises, the high density buildings. You've got your private hauler that is supposed to find a system that makes it work for you. What we find is there's a lot of confusion and miscommunication about sort of what can be accepted in some buildings. People come to Chicago, all the time from other cities, from other parts of the world. They're used to being able to recycle certain materials that perhaps an individual hauler does not accept in the city of Chicago. And it's just, we think it's just kind of confusing for a lot of folks, and we would love to see it made simpler. The city, to its credit, has really spent a lot of time and energy trying to make it simpler, but we're also struggling a bit against, this complicated global market, which is determining what will and won't be bought and sold and remade.
Can you also talk about with that, how does single-stream recycling and recycling in general fit into the generally accepted hierarchy of waste management?
Right, sure. So, ideally it's refuse. We don't want to use any products that we don't need to. That's not so good for the economy. So, not everybody is going to be hugely on board with that. We're going to go from refuse to reuse. So you want to reuse something as many times as possible. After the reuse would come recycling. I mean, recycling is a bit of a last resort in many ways. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do with like a pop can or a newspaper, although people get very creative with the newspaper, I've learned, for all kinds of things. And then after sort of recycling, you're getting down to possibly waste to energy, depending, waste to energy can go many different directions depending how clean the system is in the process. And then you get to the landfill, which is the ultimate last option. And you're hoping you've got a good landfill and the landfill is not leaking.
Okay. So recycling's important, is what you're saying?
I believe
yes.
so.
Do we all agree with that? Great. One of the topics that, as I mentioned earlier, that we focus really heavily on in our reporting at the BGA is this potential for a conflict of interest when there's the same company that handles both your recycling and your garbage pickup. So in our case, that was the City of Chicago and their arrangement with the Waste Management Company. But there's many, many other big garbage companies that have the same setup where the main aspect of their business model is garbage, and recycling is almost just a side note to all of that, and a much less profitable one at that. Michelle, and really any of you want to talk about this, I'm curious as to how you can explain how that plays out in the real world, and what does that mean as far as how much materials end up getting recycled and what the economics is of recycling?
Yeah, obviously there's the economic issue, that conflict where it really plays out. But I think there's another issue that is just as big, and that is that for the most part, waste haulers are the ones who are also hauling our recycling. And what I've seen is they drive the recycling market. And so it's like our recycling systems have been built on this waste platform. And I think that's really limited our thinking about how to recycle and how to recycle well and better. And I think we can be a lot more creative than we have been. But it's difficult when the ones driving the industry are those who have that economic incentive and also are trying to fit recycling into their existing system. I'm not going to deny that waste haulers have the infrastructure to pick up recycling materials, and from that perspective, it makes sense. But beyond that, I think we need to really look at how we've recycled in the past and our recycling systems and go back to square one and, like I said, be more creative, open up our thinking about how best to recycle and come up with the best possible recycling system. And in order to do that, I think we have to remove a lot of our recycling programs, or at least large pieces of our recycling programs, from the grip of waste haulers.
Yeah, so I like to talk a little bit about the, we call it landfill economics, basically. So really what it costs somebody to put materials by the ton, for example, in a dump, is going to really drive, if you're a waste hauler, whether or not you potentially think that that material is, quote, recyclable. Because at the end of the day, people don't like recycling if it costs them money. They think, we were all, for many years, told recycling should make you money. Like if you introduce recycling in your business or your schools, you're going to get a check, and that's like a great thing. And that is a great thing. The Midwest is sort of somewhat struggling in many ways because we do have a lot more land available, frankly, than, say, like the coasts. So if you look at like what it costs to landfill a ton of waste across the country, you're going to find that on the West Coast, it is significantly more expensive than it is in the Midwest. And when you get up to the Northeast, which has been the most developed and is the most densely populated, it can be double what it is here in the Midwest. And then you can kind of further even like dial this in where you look at what it costs to landfill in Illinois, which is, I think the last report we saw had it at about $57 a ton. And then in Indiana, our neighbor right across the border, it's about 46. And that adds up real fast in terms of providing an incentive for people instead of recycling to simply drive across the border in Indiana. And the economics that are also complicating this is that we've externalized most of these costs then to society. So, you've got a private landfill owner that is somewhere in the Midwest, and they're not paying for the roads, they're not paying to clean the air that the trucks are causing, they're not dealing with the sort of garbage as it blows out of the landfills and potentially contaminates their neighbor's land. I do think the environmental justice is a really big deal. And as a city, we need to come together over this because we have a landfill moratorium here. So all of our waste is going somewhere else. We are not dealing with any of it here in Chicago. So our moratorium is up at 2025. I think nobody in the city of Chicago thinks we should be opening more landfills here. And that it really is important that we think about how we're treating we're stewards of the earth for the duration, and also just how we deal with our neighbors around the Midwest. Chicago's garbage is going as far as 100 miles away. So these landfills in Illinois are filling up. I think the average life expectancy of landfills in our region, sort of the EPA Region 5 in Chicago, is I think about 11 years. And it's possible that you can take these existing ones and you can sort of expand them with new cells, as they call it. This is happening right now in Zion, actually. And if you sort of Google like Zion landfill, you will see a whole lot of very unhappy people about the prospect because they are the ones that are dealing with the trucks and the pollution and the waste.
Definitely, I'll probably change the direction a little bit here. There are two extremes that some people believe everything which can be recycled should be recycled. That means zero waste. So that's going to come through regulation. And on the other side, when we talk about markets and price point, and they say, hey, if something makes sense, market is there, you're getting the price point, that should be the goal. So I don't know. For me, both of them are false. I don't know. I'll have panel comment on that aspect.
Well, that's the pragmatic thing, right? Is that, are you dealing, I guess it's also a question of, are we looking at the price now? Or are we looking at the price and the cost that we are potentially passing on to our children and our children's children? So a landfill, for example, there's generally the industry standard for a landfill liner, the warranty, so to speak, is only about 20 years. So I have a professor I studied with, and I said, well, this seems kind of surprisingly short. I mean, wouldn't we think that since a landfill, which is sort of assumed by everybody to more or less last forever, that the warranty for the liner itself would have to last, at least closer to forever than 20 years? And he said, well, if somebody could profitably find a way to offer a longer warranty, they would be the kings of the industry. So the fact that they haven't done it should tell you something about, what the people in the industry themselves think that they want to sign on the dotted line in terms of that liner that's on the bottom of the landfill. There's so many reasons that, something could go wrong with the landfill and what they call the leachate, the sort of toxic kind of fluid that settles at the bottom. It could be everything from an earthquake to just something physically wrong with the installation, the materials, and you're not going to find out about it probably until it's a little too late, And to a certain degree, this kind of connects to the issue that we're thinking about, and I think the world is starting to get a little more familiar with, which is the danger of plastics in the environment. is that these plastics, they're in everything now. They are in the air, they are in the groundwater, they're in your food. Yeah, they're definitely in your food, excuse me. But they're in birds, they're in insects, they're in rivers. I mean, you literally name it. We have put plastic in every part of this environment, and we have no idea what the health impacts to people are. Absolutely none. Like, the science is still being sorted out, and unfortunately, by the time we find out what it is, if we're lucky, it's that, you know, it kind of just passes through us and, you know, breathe a sigh of relief. We've just killed off the fish and everything. But if we're not lucky, this is disrupting, you know, parts of our body that we kind of care for. So it's entering the bloodstream, it's disrupting, you know, it's going into organs. I won't get into a huge thing. I'm obviously not a specialist on this, but this is the problem, is nobody is. So by the time we understand what the real dangers of having all of this material out there is, you know, it's almost too late. So with recycling, it's something that we really need to kind of pick up, in my opinion, because it's going to be a public health hazard.
That brings me to another topic I wanted to approach, which is single-use plastics. It's obviously a huge and just significant global problem right now. It's all the ways you mentioned. There's a, you know, piece of plastic or a continent of plastic out in the middle of the ocean the size of Texas. It's estimated that if plastics pollution continues at the current rate, there'll be more fish than plastic in the ocean by 2050. And to combat this, we've seen municipalities across the country, and really actually governments across the world, enact various legislations to either outright ban certain single-use plastics, such as straws, or do some sort of taxes on them. For example, in the city of Chicago, we have this 7 cents tax on plastic bags. That is at least meant to somewhat discourage use, part of it at least. And I'm wondering what you all think about the real effectiveness of legislation like this, and what, if anything, needs to be done more so to prevent the creation and use of single-use plastics.
I'm going to kind of jump off what Carter was just saying, and that I think we need to better understand the real cost of single-use plastics, and that is from, you know, the cost of extracting the oil from the ground that goes into the making of these plastics, not only the environmental impacts of that, but the health impacts of that, and then all the way through to what we're now seeing, which is the kind of sloughing off of plastics which don't biodegrade. They photodegrade, which means they just keep breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. And as Carter mentioned, we're drinking them every single day, even bottled water. There was recently a study that came out that showed that 90% of bottled waters tested have plastics in them. And so we really need to understand that cost, and I don't know if taxing it at the true value or the true cost is the answer. I do want to point out, and this is a little bit of a diversion from this, but what we see a lot of times is we can't even enact those laws because trade associations, the plastic, I think the American Chemical Society is one of the biggest proponents of passing laws that restrict states or municipalities from passing laws banning single-use plastics. So there's a lot of that going on in the United States. I think we are starting to turn the corner, and we are seeing more laws passed. I don't think those laws have been in effect for long enough, at least in the United States, to show what the impact, positive or negative, is. But you know, Europe and Canada, Justin Trudeau I think it was yesterday or the day before, announced that Canada will be banning a lot of single-use plastics by 2021, and the European Union has also enacted that law. So I think we're going to have to wait and see, but given what we're already seeing in terms of the ill effects of single-use plastics, I do think that is a step in the right direction.
Definitely, I agree with that. I think single-use plastic is going to be a little bit challenge. By just education, we cannot solve this problem. I think some sort of regulation and price point and innovation is needed in this field. It's about time that we need to stop that, find alternatives.
It's interesting because Americans and many other countries are just so reliant on single-use plastic. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how and what people replace that with as well. But again, let's move on to talking about really the hot topic in recycling right now, China, right? It's all you ever hear about. We talk about recycling now. And as Carter mentioned before, to give you a little background, for years and years, U.S. recyclers sent much of their recyclable materials to China and other countries so that it could be processed there rather than handling it domestically. That all changed within the past few years when China instituted strict new restrictions on what sort of foreign material it would accept, and many other countries followed suit. And as a result, we're seeing a real market upheaval globally with recycling. So I was wondering if, Carter, if you could first off explain why is it that domestic recyclers sent so much of their materials to China to begin with, and what sort of effect is this having on us now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't think I would be surprising anybody that if you go into your local Target, you go into your big box store, you're getting stuff on Amazon, and you look at the country of manufacture, you're not typically going to see the United States of America anymore. You are likely to see China. So China being the country that was manufacturing many of the goods that we purchase here in America meant that they needed raw material. They had a very large population, obviously, and so they have the labor force that was able to handle then on the sort of return of that loop, the hand sorting of the material. So in recycling, I think there's sort of folks that, believe and if you see sort of like an automated sorting facility, you see robots, you see, the infrared sort of optical scanners separating different grades of plastic, and you walk out and you're like, holy cow, like this is fantastic. How could anyone not believe that this works? But the reality is that, these are very expensive facilities, and it's really largely in developed and wealthy countries that can afford these kind of places at the moment. So when you go to a country like China that has lots and lots of labor, these folks are recycling, they're sorting by hand. One of the great examples, there's a book called Junkyard Planet I would recommend to anyone who is really interested in the topic, by Adam Minter, and he got a lot of access that other Western journalists don't because he married a Chinese national while and has been over there. And he just talks about, entire warehouses full of people that are just like cutting your Christmas tree lights and stripping the plastic and the rubber off of it to get to the wire. So I don't think this is what most people think is happening, to recycle, but this is what was happening in China. But the basic end of the day was also what they call sort of like the free ride. So China is sending, all sorts of materials over here that we're purchasing consumer goods, and that boat was going back empty. So people looking to sort of make it sounds very logical to me, right? It's like, why would you send this empty boat all the way back to China? Put something on it. So, to a certain degree, I think it made perfect sense. I think the problem was we got a little bit sloppy with what we were sending to China, and China saw what started off, I'm guessing, as fairly clean recycling streams just kind of over time get worse and worse and worse in terms of both the contamination, and then apparently people were starting to just basically send them garbage. They would like tuck the garbage into the recycling bales, and this is where I think the Chinese government just kind of said they had enough and they decided to cut it.
And so what does that mean for recycling back here? We've seen different cities and states across the country handle it very, very differently. There's some cities that are shutting down their recycling programs because they think it's too expensive to process the materials here. Others have drastically changed it. For example, I think Philadelphia, if I remember correctly, has been burning much of its recycling at waste-to-energy facilities. And so what do you all think is the proper response from the local governments in dealing with this really pivotal moment in recycling? Kuldeep?
I think it's about time we innovate. I think we have very smart people with the development of artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. I think we are right there. I see a lot of technologies in the cusp of commercialization in this space, and I'm really excited to see those. But definitely, local governments, we need to provide some capital to kickstart those technologies here in the U.S. I am a believer of circular economy, but not that big of a circle, sending it to China and bringing those things back. I'm a believer of a small circular economy, very local. So I think innovation is going to happen in this space very soon. I'm optimistic about it.
Michelle, I know we talked about this a bit before the panel, but can you explain a bit about the technology in most of the plants in the U.S. Kind of built around this reliance of sending things to China? What has that meant for our own recycling facilities here?
So I am not a technical person,
Yes.
so I don't know, like I can't give you an overview of the specifics of the very like high technologically oriented recycling facilities. But I do know that there are some recycling facilities that are actually doing very well or recycling companies, I should say, that invested in the technology so that they are getting a cleaner product. And they are not suffering as much. The markets are in upheaval, but waste management, for example, since 2014 closed down over 20% of its recycling facilities, and it did not invest in recycling or in technology. And so they are struggling now, although they are building a pretty, I understand, a pretty high technology facility in Chicago that's going to open later this year. Because I think that's what companies are seeing, is that if we can get a cleaner product, then the markets will even themselves out. And I couldn't agree with Kuldeep more that it is going to be about innovation, and I am excited. It's troubling to see that so many programs are shutting down, because I don't think that's the right answer. I think this is the time where we have the opportunity to step back and see how we can do better in the future and to make those changes. So I hope that the city of Chicago will step up to the challenge. And it is a big challenge. I'm not denying that it's not. But there is a real opportunity there. I just hope I know we can meet it. It's just, are we going to?
I agree. I mean, recycling is a huge system, as I hope we've kind of all impressed on you, and it is not really something that you can just turn off and on. If you turn it off, what is likely to happen is that the sort of equipment that are needed, everything from the trucks to the plants to the skilled workers, they're going to disappear, and you're going to have a really difficult time attracting them back. One of the challenges that we are keenly familiar with, the managed competition here in Chicago, this is a case where a municipality, is put in a very awkward position of kind of competing against private companies that it also technically is in charge of overseeing and enforcing their behavior. So this is the conflict of interest that is more difficult to wrap our hands around, because there hasn't really been a good audit, and we don't really have a great handle on how well these sort of different parties that are handling the blue cart recycling are doing, both from a number sense, where is the taxpayer getting the most bang for their buck, and in terms of an environmental sense, which of them are doing the best job. Actually, we know who's doing the best job because we've visited the facilities, but in terms of what we're paying for it, we don't really have a great handle on what would happen if we gave all the blue cart recycling back to streets and sanitation. How would they handle it? What would happen if we privatized it 100%? And one of the major issues that we've got here is that we haven't done like a real waste characterization audit in 13 years at this point. So the last one that we did in the city of Chicago, the report came out in 2009, 2010, depending which version of it, but the data that they used was from 2007. And the world is completely upside down in terms of recycling markets from 2007. Although I'd add, what isn't upside down is the city's recycling rate, which is more or less about a flat line. So
Declining, yeah.
it is. Yeah, so if it's, and this, I like to take, if you could bear with me a moment to explain it, because the city's recycling rate, it really depends how you are defining the recycling rate. If we're talking about the residential recycling rate, and we're talking about the 1 to 4 unit buildings that the city is responsible for, then the last stat that we saw from Streets and Sanitation was that we're just under 9%. And that's terrible. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We don't really know how much of that 9% is actually getting recycled, which is even more terrible. The waste characterization audit that I'm mentioning, which is from, again, 2010, it actually stated that the multi-unit buildings, which is a lot of units here in Chicago, it's about 600,000 that are served by the blue carts, the 1 to 4 unit buildings, and it's maybe another 350,000, give or take, that are the 5+ unit buildings. And the 5+ unit buildings in the waste characterization study were listed back, 10 years ago as having a recycling rate closer to 20%. I think it was 18%, 17 or 18%. And then if you look at the sort of bigger picture in the city of how we just sort of manage our waste altogether, we're really very good at doing some things like construction and demolition debris waste. So this is where the city has really been tremendously effective. I think Cook County has also done a good job of taking advantage of building codes and working with contractors, and that can be as high as 60 or 70%. So, it's a really sort of baffling thing when you put it all together because it kind of depends which side of the cube you're looking at. But the city of Chicago's last diversion rate that they sort of put their name on was 41%. And that's still not fantastic, but that's a heck of a lot better than, 8 or 9.
I'm getting the signal to wrap things up here so we can get to questions. But before we do that, I just want to kind of ask each of you. We have a lot of Chicago residents in the audience. I'm sure a lot of Chicago area residents. People always want to know, what can you do as an individual to help recycling in your community? And, what is it each of you would like to see from our elected leaders as well as far as recycling programs go? So start with Kuldeep.
That's a difficult one. I think, first of all, personally myself, I need to define what is recyclable and what is garbage. And you'll be amazed to get a very different answer. So we need to rank according to resources or what is the cost-benefit life cycle analysis, that these are the top 10 things we need to recycle because of the resource conservation. What is the water footprint? What is the carbon footprint for not doing that? I think that is a bigger task. First thing I would like some smart people to handle and give me that top 10 list. And then it will be very easy to educate people to do that. Now we have the actual data and reasons to do that. I think working on that for me is a bigger challenge, and I hope somebody takes that.
Thank you.
So I think the data is the key, and this is where we're kind of lacking at the moment. I mean, what we really need is to take advantage of modern society and its ability to sort of grab data from all over the place and have a transparent look at it and to be able to assess where we're doing things well and where we would be better served sort of prioritizing our efforts. So the first thing that we would sort of suggest is that we just look at the waste system in Chicago, look at the whole thing. I mean, I've lived here my whole life, and I have to say, I was a little surprised when I read somewhere they were like, oh, Chicago, where they give everybody 2 black carts in the in the alley and only 1 recycling cart, and I was like, whoa, like I was thought I was doing pretty great when I got a blue cart for the first time, and what they're doing in the rest of the world is they're downsizing the garbage carts. So, they're moving to sort of pay-as-you-throw systems, as we call it, and what that's kind of doing is it's trying to correct that negative externality of how much does it cost to actually take your garbage somewhere. So I think, what we'd really like to see is a new waste characterization audit, and then we would like to see sort of a real move by the city to modernize how we are collecting and analyzing the data, because there are many, many very smart people out there, but they're not going to be able to do anything unless they have good information to work with.
Well, what I would like all of us to do is to recycle better. I won't ask you to be a total recycling geek like I am, but if you have questions about whether something is recyclable, go on Recycle by City for Chicago and take a look and make sure that what you put in if you have a blue bin or what your recycling bin, make sure that it should go in there. Don't engage in what's known as wishful recycling, which is really want. I mean, I would love everything to be recyclable, but some things just are not, and ensuring that we recycle properly and do not contribute to contamination is particularly important at this point in time. And I believe we can just continue to build from there once we, get the basics down. In terms of the city, I agree. We need the data. We need to know what's going on, and once we get that, I think my hope would be that we would move to zero waste, becoming a zero waste city, and doing everything we can. In the interim, I would love to see a pay-as-you-throw pilot. I would love to see the city do that, and I'd also love to see a composting pilot done by the city of Chicago.
Whole other topic, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot there, but great, thank you all. Those are all really great tips for everybody and, things to push for as well.